You're listening to The Adventuring Party for the first week of November 2020. This week, the party have a confession to make. We don't actually use all the rules in the book. The Adventuring Party, discussing tabletop and related gaming the Irish way. Welcome to the party. I'm Scarr, still, apparently.
I'm still Savage.
And I am eternally Gavin.
Gavin's good to have you back.
It's good to be back in the land of the living.
It's been a hot minute, hasn't it?
And a cold, cold year.
I don't know, I haven't been able to sleep for the heat.
It is. We are all sticky messes in this blisteringly hot September. Gavin, when was the last time you were on with us?
It has been a long time. I'm trying to remember. I think it was definitely in the before times, before the doom and gloom truly manifested itself.
I believe it was January, or like you recorded in December, but the episode came out in January.
Yes.
What on earth did we talk about?
I just remember decrying balance in games, and that it's wrong and should die, and also your cat. They're my two fondest memories of that recording session.
That will make you eternally popular amongst many of our listeners. I don't have a cat. This must have been with fellow host Sean. Yeah, Sean is a cat person. I am not, as anyone who knows me will attest. Anyways, right, we're not here to talk about the before times because they are lost to history. Mm-hmm. Scarr, why are we here?
We're here to talk about rules, and specifically, we're here to talk about the rules that no one likes to talk about. The rules that get ignored in the running of our RPGs, and why we keep tearing out these pages in our mental rulebook and just leaving them in the trash can of we'll look it up later.
Yeah. Fudge it. Never judge it. Okay, well, I think it's only fair that we cede the floor first to Gavin. Give him a good running start at this while we lay caltrops. What do you say?
I'm one who has often favoured ignoring much of the rules in RPGs, and that is partly due to my introduction to RPGs, it being 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons, a system famed for its rule set, and the hatred that it generated among the player base. So much so that it spawned its own separate RPG that was created in direct opposition to it. So I'm going to talk to you today about the combat system of 4th edition, and why, in the fullness of time, I have come to actually love it.
I am breaking out into a sweat here. Go on.
So when I was first introduced to RPGs, it was through 4th edition, and I loved it. I loved the system. I loved the concept of role playing, and I tended to introduce it to listening to podcasts and people playing it back in 2008, 2009, back when podcasts were just recently coming across the field, or if you're the adventuring party, where we're going strong. But I was introduced to it, and I was certainly intrigued by the role playing. And when I sat down to actually play it, I was incensed by the idea of this long, difficult, strategic encounter that got in the way of my role playing. So I would often orchestrate events in my games that made as little combat as possible, because I knew that it would take 5-6 hours, and then the game would end after that fairly conclusively. It's a slow system. If you haven't played 4th edition, it's quite quite tactical, which often means which translates to players coming around and not knowing what to do in their turn, which can be quite difficult. And so I would just, try to avoid it as much as possible, or introduce elements that would make it go as quickly as possible, which then just ended up making not that fun. And then I sort of switched on to 5th edition when that rolled around in the scene, and I was like, this is great. It's a lot quicker. There's not as much worrying about rule systems. You don't need to be as tactically minded to get through encounters. And it wasn't until later that I sort of came back to it and realized that the combat in 4th edition is quite satisfying if you know what you're doing, if you can understand it, if you understand your own character and how your character works, which when I first started playing, my players did not at all.
You were running it as a GM, of course, so you had to have perhaps more engagement with these systems than the other people at your table, and it kind of wasn't for you to begin with, yeah?
Yeah, my first introduction was as a GM. I never played an RPG without running it first, and it wasn't years until I actually sat down and played one as a player. And that sort of that put a lot of mental load on me not knowing it. And I think that there's been a lot of good DNA that has come out of the 4th edition system, and I've revisited it later on and found it to be quite engaging. The sort of the use of powers, your abilities are spread up into at-will powers, encounter powers, and daily powers that you sort of keep track of and control, and it's got a very good health recovery mechanic, and that it's a resource you spend. That's a very nice way of keeping track of this individual fight, but also of a fight as a whole. And it plays out like a very, very interesting tactics RPG that I think a lot of people, when they first jumped on it, didn't like, because that was a part of D&D, but that wasn't what D&D. D&D was a role-playing game where you fight things, and it's very, dramatic, and, things change by the roll of the dice and by, thinking ingenuitively as opposed to tactically. And that sort of was a culture shock for a lot of people.
That's very interesting. Like, I do like the idea that we've, much like 4th Ed helped spur on both the Pathfinder revival and the OSR. I like the idea that 5th Ed has sort of spurred on a second look at 4th Ed and where its strengths lay. And yeah, I do get the idea of a rule we ignored at the time or tried to minimize it at the time, but as we got better with it, we took another look at it and see, oh yeah, that's what that's for. And I think that might actually be pretty germane to our topic here, is that an awful lot of the time, rules get ignored because when we're starting out with a game, we don't appreciate what each element of it is doing. But there is very often a secret reason for the mechanic that maybe we just didn't see. I think we may have had an episode on that earlier, but anyway, let's keep on with this episode.
No new ground to be fought over.
I think perhaps I should go next, because I suspect Mick has saved up in his craw, particularly venomous topic.
Ooh. Hold your horses, you son of a gun. I'd just like to take a poke at Gavin here before we move on.
Okay, fair.
I thought I was going to go through there unscathed.
No. Sit down. We're not done yet. You leave those chips on the table, or else I'll draw on you. 4th, so you're content. I do like the fact that you're going big or going home. You've decided rules that have been ignored, an entire edition of D&D. There's a whole bunch of it that we should continue to ignore because it was rubbish. The hit bag sort of monster bag, the hit dice monster bag, the hit point monster bag, the hit point punching bag that D&D
previous
4th
episode, Mr. E, I believe, made a big point of this in the wed bed head section.
Yeah, he hated it, and he was quite right, because that and the absolute flatness of the math in 4th Ed meant that it was quite painful. I mean, you rightly identified at the first instance, combat takes way too long, and if you're not like tactically sort of minded and totally clued in on the game state, then when it comes around to your turn, you are shuffling cards and going, oh hell, which do I use a daily? Do I use a counter? What am I going to do? And the big old brutes didn't help that situation. So I think there's plenty of bits of fourth ed that we can happily discard forever. It is the last time we need to learn some of those lessons. But I think you're absolutely right. On the other hand,
I will take those extremely palpable hits.
There's loads of stuff in fourth ed that was discarded out of hand and really should, and has in some cases, been folded back in. But it's not. We're not finished yet. We need to get some of those. Go on. I will cede the floor. I'll give way.
Thank you. I will admit for my shame that although I may be defending for the edition, I will never run a campaign of it ever again.
All right. Well, I've said my piece.
You've broken his poor heart.
Who are we moving on to? Is it? You've got I can be very brief. Shall I be very brief?
You've been saving up your rant about this for weeks.
I got a lot of it out in one of our last Wed Bed Beheads, so and I'm going to return to it now. So if I'm very brief, I'll cede the rest of our time to you, dear Scarr.
I have like 5 topics. I want to go around the thing a couple of times. I was hoping you guys had more than one.
I got one.
I'm all for giving Scarr more time to rant.
Tell you what, I'll do mine, and then we'll do all of yours, and I'll just throw in silly interjections as we go. The encumbrance rules. The encumbrance rules are, as often as not, discarded like so much weighty baggage. And I think that's an absolute crying shame, because they, in some ways, what we carry with us defines our adventures. A lot of you, dear listeners, you're going to have heard most of this before from me. Encumbrance rules are often overlooked because they are fiddly, and their worst iterations, because they are sometimes, it is much easier to sort of hand wave away the minutiae of the logistics and the kind of bean counting that comes with encumbrance rules. But for my money, I think they're where a lot of adventures can live and die. What you hold and what you let go of, for me, define so many dramatic moments in our favourite stories. Does Sam Gamgee bring the dwarf bread, or does he bring the saucepans? And the entirety of Middle-earth's history, the War of the Ring, would have played out differently depending on the decisions of that one hungry hobbit. It's stuff like this that really gets me going. It's a very Jack London-esque survival story place to play, when everything you bring with you could have some huge significance at a clutch moment in a story. And it also, I think, you don't want to have that golf bag of weaponry. There should be your adventure, your character should be someone who is keyed into doing one sort of heroic thing. So they shouldn't be walking around like Casey Jones with a weapon for every occasion, because it breaks their reliance on the rest of the party to have covered those other bases. That's kind of why you're adventuring together, to look out for each other, to help carry the load. And in its most ancient iteration, what you could carry directly affected how much XP you left the dungeon with, how much gold you had to spend, how much you would advance. There were no free lunches, no free rides. You had to figure out how to get in there and how to get out with your ill-gotten gains. And I think that's an adventure in and of itself. Instead of it being a sort of a ding moment when you hit the button and the tally pops up and the GM tells you how much money you've got, you instead should be looking at a pile of completely awkward loot going, well, what can we take with us? And what can we afford to leave? And what might we sacrifice in terms of useful equipment because of our avarice? I think there's huge potential in enforceable, runnable encumbrance rules. I personally these days prefer a combination of things like ammo dice or use dice to track consumables, and very simple kind of slot-based encumbrance backpacks or slots on your character sheet to dictate exactly what you have where. Computer games do it very well because they make it easy to track, but we've, a pegboard approach or a token approach, something like that, could be useful here. I've talked enough. What do you think, guys? Is it a load of old baggage, or what can we do about encumbrance?
Because I was anticipating this, I have way too many answers, both for and against your thing. So I'm going to leave it to Gavin first.
Mine is the concern, a practical concern of both as a player and as a GM. In a perfect world, yes, encumbrance would be a perfect mini game of trying to figure out what you have room for, what you don't have room for, and this is done perfectly in many video games. It is a moment of strategy and sort of adds tension as a player. But in RPGs, there is no rule system that I have seen that does that both accurately and in a way that is satisfying. In a perfect world, I think such a system would exist, but I've seen many different variants of encumbrance. You mentioned a few of them, slots and sort of ammo dice and that kind of thing, but there is an element of abstraction there that sort of takes away from the satisfaction that one might glean from encumbrance, which is accuracy in its method.
Yeah, no, not fair at all. No, I think you're missing the point, Gavin. Like, I don't need to know down to the last nickel or kobold's eyeball what an adventurer weighs. I should have a good idea, though, that the paladin laid down with armour and armaments much heavier than the nimble thief, and that drives certain sort of scenarios, certain opportunities for peril, for the sheer gravity of a situation to play differently on differently encumbered characters. But I don't really care exactly what they weigh. But I think the abstraction here helps to move things along and to achieve some sense of weight, gravity, of opportunity, of what is carried and what is lost. But
where do you draw the line, though, in terms of abstraction? You might have an idea of the perfect point at which abstraction is good and bad, but that can vary for other people. Like maybe you split it into light and heavy things, or big and small items, or you have a 9-tiered system. Some people might like one, some people like it better. The granularity of encumbrance rules reflects on the granularity of items and encumbrance in general, and I think it's a compromise we've made that by and large it is a system that is widely disregarded because people don't want to deal with the minutiae of encumbrance rules as many people don't want to deal with the minutiae of encumbrance.
Well, there's the people who don't want to, and there's people who will insist on doing it because it reads to them as tricking the system. It's rarely the person who's picking up, a couple of rocks to throw at distract the guards. It's usually the person who says, well, you said last week that this handkerchief doesn't count as encumbrance, so I've clearly filled my pack with 500 handkerchiefs, each of which is weightless.
Gavin, you confound me and you contradict yourself. If you insist that encumbrance rules must be granular or at least ideally they'd be granular to a point of accounting for all trinkets and tidbits, then you cannot in the same breath ask that they be disregarded because they tend to be so, pun intended, cumbersome to run. The abstraction is the point, that we account for it without getting weighed down by it. 500 handkerchiefs aside, I think a GM paying attention is going to look at that as a clear manipulation that will be struck down the next time you hit a rope bridge or a deep crevasse. Let's see what they weigh in the balance of the game, or what use you can make of them to avoid your fate.
Sorry, I missed most of what you said because of the blood pounding from Scarr's comments over similar conversations I've had in the past.
Let us agree now to disagree. Unless Scarr wants to stir any further. Go, then.
Sorry, I've been saving up. For the same reason you've been saving up your encumbrance rant, I've been saving my counter rant.
Well, then spend your ammunition. I'll take the shot.
I see. For me, it comes in two different issues as to why encumbrance gets thrown on the pile, as it were. One is the trouble of tracking, that we're often relying on pencil and eraser on our meticulously printed out character sheets, and just tearing holes as we run through our potions of cure moderate sniffles and such. And the rust monster eats her sword. Well, just better start feeding him extra swords because I have 15 of them for some reason. And it's less that tracking encumbrance is bad, it is that a tabletop pencil and paper based system is not the ideal for using. We keep using the analogy of computer games, and playing Tetris with your inventory and the likes of Resident Evil is very satisfying in its own way, but it's very difficult to do that on a tabletop without some additional aid. Like, you'll see really cool systems and board games for tracking your equipment. You'll have a hand of cards, or you'll have a little character board for which you have a certain number of equipment slots. But it's a lot more difficult to do that in a RPG, which is sort of defined by its anything goes possibility, and you don't know if you're going to have one set of leather armor, one sword, and 3 iron rations. It could be on the surface of Pellucidar Mars, and having a 3-piece quad rock to fight with while clothed in Balsnars, and you get things. It's just like the more stringent a encumbrance system is to make it manageable, the less flexible it is, and an awful lot of RPGs. A lot of RPG players want the flexibility more than they want the robust system. So you always got to have to compromise there. The other part I want to bring up, and this is for me.
Wait. No, before you do that, do not wear away with me with your arguments over the fragility of the parchment upon which you record the numeric soul of your character. Surely, under the same constraints, you'll have worn a hole through the table, adjusting your hit points and armor value, if it is the substrate you worry about for so much. No, I don't buy that for a second. We spend far more time adjusting the count of our hit dice and hit points than we ever do adjusting what lies in our backpacks. I take that argument and I discard it as worthless and weightless. Go on.
Okay. Well, the other point I was going to... Well, I think that I have a third, more positive point at the end. But anyway, the next point was that if you're not in that, what we carry is what we define as mindset, that, Savage emphatically jumped on. I feel like some people just sort of naturally look down on that sort of keep a hammer, keep 10 iron spikes, keep an 11.5 foot pole mindset, because to them, it's not the point of the game. The point of the game is to get to level 10 and have your fire acid ball and your whirlwind neck cleaver attack. The idea that equipment is essentially a level 1 solution and you want to move on to the level 10, 15 problems, that fiddling around with knickknacks that you picked up in your character pack is not the point of the game. Now, that's, of course, a very subjective opinion, and I'm not one I really hold myself, but I can see why people would think that. In that, if the point of the game is to expand the scope of the game to, traveling the planes and leading armies and, conquering space stations, then the fact that you have, like, flint and tinder and a cool, thing that makes your sword glow in the dark it might seem like so much irrelevant. The idea that if you define the game by what's in your backpack, then your game will never grow. Now, of course, you could always counter that with the idea that your backpack should also, be carrying weightier things as you go up. But then you have an endless escalation of items where at level 1 you're carrying like a sword and a set of iron rations, and at level 15 you're playing a +7 sword and Theta Omega rations that give 5 days of food and +20 to sleep saves.
I think there's definitely a horses for courses element that I have to admit. This is not the encumbrance rules should not apply everywhere at all times. You're absolutely right on your second point as well, that it is not enough to simply play a dry game of inventory management. The more fantastic the objects you acquire along the way should, almost by necessity, help you to discard mundane concerns, like how much you can carry. Although I'll draw the line as firmly as ever under the bag of holding as a complete bloody cop-out. But I think I've probably said enough at this point.
Well, I think your last point there does sort of meld into what my point was, is that the ideal encumbrance system should be one that brings choices. And they can definitely be adventure-defining choices or even character-defining choices. That you chose to take those iron spikes or that 11 feet of rope, and that mattered because you made it matter. And I think that's where a good encumbrance system has to leave its focus. It's in what did that character choose to bring on that time. And I think that's where that's where encumbrance things, because if you can carry anything, then what you carry doesn't really matter, because you could have carried everything.
Exactly. Well, let us leave this one aside, because you've been on the attack for far too long now, Scarr.
Oh.
It's time to push you onto the defensive. Let's have it. Let's hear what your particular predilection is in terms of ignored and forgotten rules.
Oh. We've been ranting for longer than I realised, so we might need to...
We have.
Yeah.
You're like a dog with a bone.
I had two good ones. I think I've already ranted about downtime mechanics and, the whole dramatic arc of those in a previous episode. So perhaps I will go with another one, which I will call environmental features and penalties. This is pieces of the world that we ignore for the sake of... this is not a million miles away from the what's in your backpack, how are you carrying 17 ladders question that we just ordered. But I tend to look at other things like the
senses. What are the concrete examples?
Light and darkness. Like, we walk into, this lightless tomb, which is buried under 500 feet of rock, and has never been opened in human memory, and everyone just sort of sees the skulls on the floor, and, comments on all these cobwebs on the roof, and it's just like, how do we see this? I was just say, someone's carrying a torch. It's like, who? We have, No Hands McGee over there, who's replaced his hands with... magical spells in the midair. 3 guys with great swords glued to their hands because otherwise they'll get disarmed. And a rogue who his hands are always busy because they're in someone else's pockets. Who's carrying the torch and it's just like, whatever. And the logistics of being in the world are sort of being pushed aside for we want to do things. Let's play with the skulls and the dust on the floor. And stuff like that. Stuff like, senses that don't get used.
I feel that it's part of the character creation process. I feel it stems from, people's, opinion of what occurs in the game. Is creating a vacuum. When you build your character. You build your character to do specific things. You build your character to explore. You build your character to find things out, and you build your character to fight in a vacuum when you're creating your character. But the real world isn't a vacuum. But oftentimes that can, or the fantasy world or the science fiction world in which actually the science fiction world might be a vacuum. In which case, I don't think your players will last particularly long. But but the real world can change things. Sometimes the things you're fighting fly and aren't part of the environment. Sometimes extreme heat results in you not being able to work effectively. Or in one instance, weather. Weather is another example of what you're saying. Most fights, you presume, occur on cloudless days, no wind, no rain, no adverse weather effects, and oftentimes I've seen as a GM who brings in weather effects, it can serve as a detriment to players who have built their characters around the presumption that they will fight in perfect conditions, room temperature, everything's fine. For example, weather. In Pathfinder, there's a very extensive system for fighting in weather. That really, if you're fighting in quite stormy conditions, negates any sort of ranged weapon fighters or damage dealers at all. And you have to strike that balance between what is good for the players and what keeps them engaged, and what is engaging and what seems interesting as, representing this world you're creating.
Yeah, I think the idea of the made in a vacuum character is part of the issue here. But for me, I think an awful lot of it stems from the limitations of description, in that by and large 90% of an RPG is communicated through the GM saying things, and an awful lot of the time GMs are in a rush to get to the dramatic question of what can you do? What do you do? They forget to ask the question, well, can they see what's on the box text in front of me? Can they hear the noise come from the secret tomb next door? I think an awful lot of the reason that we just assume that secret doors are DC 20 to find and 10 minutes to make the roll is that we forget that, people can just be quiet and listen for a draft or smell the pile of corpses in the next room. It's more a piece of awareness than I think this is like the GM doesn't remember it in the moment because he or she is too busy focusing on getting the players to their decision point, and thus the world suffers as a result. It is less described. It is almost entirely visual, and how you got that visuals through the impenetrable fog of darkness is tossed aside in order to get to the good stuff, quote unquote.
One thing is a lot of people are leery of is a so-called critical role effect, that the game sort of on screen, typically Critical Role or many others are oftentimes setting unrealistic and expectations for players. But I think one thing we can learn from shows like that is they do a very good job of setting the world, of you as a listener feeling part of it. And I think those kinds of decisions, sort of descriptions, and it doesn't have to be anything major, it doesn't have to be, severely mechanically penalizing or beneficial, but I think taking your time, as you say, GMs often rush to those decision points, to the quote-unquote action, the meat of the encounter, but sort of taking your time to set the scene and introducing those mechanical effects really helps a player get into that world and feel like they're really there.
Mick, would you like to do a toilet all over our wonderful points?
Well, it was my Uncle Wiley who used to say to me, "Little savage, if you can't say anything confrontational or controversial, say nothing at all." This was right before he handed me both ends of an electric fence and then went off to turn on the power. I wired his tractor chassis to the same electric fence later that week, so I feel like we both reached an understanding. My trouble at this point is that I actually wholeheartedly agree. And if there's one thing I like even more than encumbrance rules, it is satisfying environmental elements that twist or turn a battlefield or an encounter that would otherwise be perfectly simple into something that is fraught with uncertainty and danger. I think you're absolutely right. I'd add to that elevation and slopes are also very hard to portray on the 2D battlefield, but along with driving rain or tumbling water or avalanching snow, they make for ways that all of a sudden upset the character in a vacuum's game plan in a very satisfying way, and one that will turn an otherwise humdrum encounter into something that your players will talk about forever. So I can't say a word against the inclusion of mud and fog and steaming jungle mists or driving tundra rain, anything of those. I've been in so many of those situations myself that they've left their mark. So yeah, 100% agree. What can I say? I've let myself down. I've let Uncle Wiley down, and maybe I've even let our listeners down. But I have to back you to the hilt here, Scarr.
Okay. Well,
I know it's a terrible way to end.
I have a whole bunch of other things in this list, although a lot of them are less rules that get ignored as play style elements get ignored. Stuff like alignment or downtime or your character getting old. But that's possibly an episode for another day.
Absolutely.
Any final thoughts?
Gavin?
I feel that, the key is experimentation, is finding out what rule systems work for you, and don't be slaves to using one particular one. Like, in a session, if you want to try something out, try it out. There's no need to say, oh, we don't like using the chase mechanics in this RPG. There's no reason you can then ignore them later on, or try different ones. The experimentation and finding out which systems are right for you will lead to a better game.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll sort of echo some of that and say perhaps be selective. Say take a set like the pursuit mechanics Gavin mentioned, and maybe if you're the GM and you've largely ignored them, it's all right to take those mechanics and make them the focus of a session. Get something out of them, explain to your players that they'll be used in full as written for this session, to explore what's fun, unique and interesting about them. And maybe that'll sort of get picked up in the game later on, but have the bravery to pick up forgotten rules and apply them once in a while, just to see see if your group maybe takes to them in a way that others might not.
I would ask listeners that if there's a rule that you're just sort of, your eyes just sort of glaze over in the rule book, maybe look up other discussions about them, other people's solutions. Have they also discarded it, or have they done diatribes online explaining why they're essential and have to be done in full? Or are there alternate takes out there? Just take a look around, see what the discourse says, and give it a second chance, just to see what are they adding to the game and what are you missing out on if you toss them out onto the cold street. But anyway, I think we've been ignoring the fact that we're supposed to be doing 30 minutes episodes now. So, if you'd like to hit us up on social media and explain the rules that need to be expunged from the game or brought back in from the cruel, randomly generated weather of the streets outside, hit us up on our social media. But for now, this party is over. Thanks for listening to The Adventure Party. You can find show notes and links to things we've mentioned at www.theadventuringparty.net and on our Facebook page. You can leave comments there, or talk to our Twitter account at AdventurePTY, or you can record a voice message at www.speakpipe.com/theadventuringparty. We can also be contacted directly by email at party@theadventuringparty.net. If you'd like to be in touch with the party all the time, come join our Discord server, link in the show notes. The Adventuring Party is released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share Alike version 3 license.